Good morning. All of our Sunday school kids, let's line up and head over to the sanctuary to sing. Okay, come on down. Thank you. Oh, so loud. Okay. Hello, good morning. We're doing archaeology in the Bible, and it's not as strong as some of the other things, but I think it's fairly strong. It's an interesting thing to talk about because perhaps you've learned it in the past. We're going to talk about the crossing of the Red Sea today and the evidence we have for it. So there's basically three predominant theories, okay? Three theories. Number one, at one time, actually, there's probably four, isn't there? Because the lake one and the swamp one, right? So at one time up here in this area, there was a rather large lake. And then there's also a kind of a rushy, reedy area. And the Red Sea, that's what they call the Red Sea, because like a sea of reeds, things like not because it's actually a red color, so the Reed Sea. So there's kind of, I want to go with three for today, just for clarification purposes. Okay, there's three things that when the Israelites, after the Passover, have plundered the Egyptians, right? The angel of death has gone through the camp. All the people are very upset. They're basically like, get out of here. We don't want you here anymore. Before Pilate changes his mind, or not Pilate, Pharaoh changes his mind and goes after him. But that period where he says, okay, just Hebrews, get out, right? There's three things of, there was the thought that the Red Sea crossing kind of happened like literally right outside of the area of Goshen, where there was this kind of swampy area, and there was the moment kind of happened here, okay? The other one is that they went south, and then it happened here, or thereabouts. And I think the one that has the most evidence biblically, also from secondary sources like Josephus, and also a certain amount of like archaeology. In this context, not archaeology, but more, I don't know if you'd call this archaeology, but almost all of the geography matches up better, a lot better. That the Red Sea crossing, most likely, the Reed crossing actually happened probably here on the Gulf of Aqaba. Okay? How many of you have always thought it was here? Yeah? And I think for a very long time in CPH actual confirmation materials, they taught that it happened here. So that would not be surprising. So let's back up for a minute. Immediately after the Passover and the Israelites leave, they want to go via the way of the sea. Anyone know what the way of the sea is? So you kind of have like the Mediterranean Sea here, right? You've got Egypt, the Nile, all that, and then Canaan would have been up here. The way of the sea would have been simply walking along the Mediterranean Sea this direction. Does anybody remember what happens as they're trying to go the way of the sea? Do you remember? They meet another tribe of people called the Amalekites. And they turn them southward. They say, no, you can't come into, they were kind of in this area, you can't come into our territory, you can't pass through. So instead of, you got the kind of the sea here, then you got the Sinai Peninsula, and then you got the sea there, and then you got Jordan. I'm a terrible drawer. They force them south into the Sinai Peninsula. Okay? Oh, that's not what I wanted. I wanted this. Instead of going, so if you can imagine the Mediterranean Sea up here, the way of the sea, going just, because it is the shortest route there. I mean, going from Egypt to Israel doesn't take long at all if you can walk along the beach. But instead they turn them south, and they start following a trader's route that still exists today. People still use it to this day, and it kind of navigates through these little box canyons. Can you see that there, this little path? Okay, so now you can kind of see Moses leads them out I'm going to make the case for. I can't definitively say that, but I'm going to make the case for. Moses leads them out to this area here, which is this isn't a sandbar, this is actually a landmass underneath it. So it's not just something that is there and then disappears and is there again. It's pretty consistent. He leads them out into this area, and you can see why they've got what? Water in front of them. And if the Egyptians are following them, is there anywhere else they can go? There's no ways out of there. There's one way in, there's one way out. If the Egyptians are behind them right here, there's nowhere to go. They are absolutely trapped, right? And also, this is one of the shortest spots between here and here. You've got a little land area here on it's very kind of mountainous, or at least, maybe not mountains, but it's definitely higher elevations here. Here as well. There's a little spot here, and then it continues on this way. You'll find, too, if you look at topographical analysis of the ocean, too, here, the Gulf of Aqaba, it's very deep here, it's very deep here, and then it's lower here. Or I should say the land is higher underneath. It's shallower here. Not a lot shallower, but it definitely shallows. And the one thing that's helpful is that this land, this kind of bridge underneath, if you look at some of the elevation things, this gets quite deep. And maybe what you never thought about is if you cross a sea bottom, what other than the area being dry, which God takes care of, so that's not a problem. So what's your other problem when you cross an empty seabed? Sure? Yes, I would agree with that. What else would you say it out loud? The topography, right? If it's a typical kind of, like the ocean is deceiving. It's so big we forget how quickly it drops off. The continental shelf, goes for a while, but then it just plunges, right? So this area here is fairly, it's deep, but it's not as drastic of a dump down and dump up. So you could actually make this climb through here, right? And then again, too, it is a miracle. We don't want to use. There's this tendency to want to prove God. We don't need to prove God. I like to think of it the other way around, that God did this miracle, and there are things left over that can point to that miracle and give us evidence that it really happened, and that's wonderful, right? The other thing, too, is I put it in your lesson there, I don't know if I put it in the Bible study. Galatians 4. Let's open up to that real quick first. Before we just we'll dive into Exodus here in a minute, but I just want to talk about the actual Red Sea crossing for a second. Galatians 4. Here we go. We get into verse 20. Let's start at verse 21, for example. Well, yeah, 21 is okay. So Paul's is talking about regular theological stuff. I don't think he's meaning to give us geographical hints, but he does. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman, but the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children from slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. That's the big aha moment here, okay? So what exactly is Arabia? Let's see here. Oh, that's fun. Let's take a look at that. 120, that's really far back. Oh, yeah, there you go. It is my take that the crossing happens here and Mount Sinai is here in this area that was known as Arabia, which makes a lot of sense too, because then their approach to Israel makes a little bit more sense, because they're going to be here and then travel up this way towards Israel, beyond the western side of Israel, crossing over into the river crossing of the River Jordan into Israel in the book of Joshua. So my take is that Mount Sinai is actually here. Right here. Jebel El Lawz or Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. Right? That's the Mount Sinai. Okay, so Josephus talks about that there were he talks about these box canyons as well. Mountains that terminated the sea, which was impassable by reason of the rough, has obstructed their flight. So Josephus is writing about stuff he's heard from Jews who have talked about this stuff here, where they were following this route in the wilderness, and when they got here, they couldn't go back any direction because it was a box canyon. There's only one way in, right? And then, I didn't get a, did anyone, is there a, there it is right there. I didn't actually get a copy. Isaiah 19:19, if you guys want to open to that. Okay. So, in that day the Egyptians will be like women and tremble with fear before the hand of the Lord of hosts over them. And the land of Judah will become a terror to the Egyptians. Everyone to whom it is mentioned will fear because of the purpose that the Lord of hosts has purposed against them. In that day there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. One of these will be called the cities of destruction. In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. So, if we look at, I didn't talk about this as well, in the time of the pharaohs, what was this area? Who owned this area? The Sinai Peninsula. Like during the time of Egypt and the pharaohs, who was seen as kind of the owner of that area? Egypt was. They had garrisons in various places, but there was hardly anybody living here because it's incredibly dry. It's very rocky. You can't do agriculture here. This is a land of like Bedouins and travelers that no one really kind of like sets down houses and lives here, at least not without modern things like aqueducts and water and stuff like that. Right? It's mostly empty. But if you were to kind of take an army through it, it would be seen as an act of war against Egypt, because it was basically ruled over by Egypt. So this is what Isaiah is saying. The border of the territory of Egypt, there's a pillar set up, right? Well, then we go forward. We have this set built into this right here. It used to be closer to the edge of the ocean, but it was moved many years ago, and then established this little concrete platform here. You can't see it, but it's there. They've kind of put it in a more permanent sightseeing thing. But the weird part is, of course, these areas are not real gentle or kind to Christians. It's really hard to travel and see these places. And so not many people go there. But you can see all this. The reason why I put this satellite picture in is you can actually see the pillar on the satellite picture right here. And then this is the actual thing. And then that's a close-up of it's right there. So it does still exist, this pillar. So there, the antiquity suggests that there were 2 pillars, one set up on this side and one set up on this side of the crossing to mark the place where the crossing happened. And the tradition goes, the story goes that Solomon set up those 2 pillars to mark the place. They did a similar thing in the River Jordan. They also built an altar where they crossed the River Jordan as well. It was very common to do this. Jacob built an altar where he saw the vision of the ladder going up and down into heaven. And wherever he built wells, things like this. It was really common to set up a remembrance or a marking of important moments. So I'm going to back up then and just say, one last time, it's my kind of belief that the Reed Sea crossing happened here, Mount Sinai is here, and the people of Israel in the wanderings of the desert eventually start here and end up there. if that makes any sense. Any thoughts? Any comments? Go ahead. Oh, that's a great question. I think I want to say, I would guess it's about, I would guess it's less than 20 miles. Because if you look at, if you were to look at a picture of Israel in comparison to these two bodies of water, Israel's 10 miles across. So I'm guessing it's less, like, well, and then this picture too, I mean, you can kind of see the other side from one side, so it can't be that far. That's a great question. This land area is not much. I don't think it's even a square mile. So, 17? 12 to 17, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So not even that long of a walk. I mean, we read from the story, it takes about a day, and we know from the Gospels that that's about how far a person could walk in Israel in a day, about 20 miles or thereabouts is about a normal day's walk. So that makes sense that they could make the crossing in that amount of time, 17 to 12 miles. Right. Now, this whole area is about 100 meters deep. Yeah. So you go off this way or you go down here, it drops, like it starts dropping off and it gets real. In fact, this section up here is real deep. Yeah, yeah. For that kind of a body of water, it's crazy. So this area here is very, comparatively, it's still not, I wouldn't call it shallow. No, it's still deep. It's still deep, but it comparatively to these two spots, it's way shallower. And also, again, it makes this idea, right? Like, you can crawl out of that. You can't, if it's just an absolute 1,500 meter deep, you're not climbing out of that. There's no way. So, right. Well, and then the other thing too, you go back, there are no similar structures in this body of water anywhere. And I'm just I think this is by reason of getting rid of the other two options. I can't think of the word I'm thinking of. Thank you. What is wrong with my brain? COVID, I swear. I had COVID twice, now I can't remember things. Process of elimination, there's no similar structures here. I mean, I guess you could say like here, but I think the same problem for here as in the idea of there being like a swampy reed sea here, is that the Bible really gives a sense that they get away and they're away for a while before Pharaoh starts to come after them. I don't know how that works if they're just crossing the Reed Sea here. That doesn't make sense to me. And then the same thing would be if you're saying, well, they just crossed the very edge of this. Why? Why not just cross here instead? Like, well, there was no Suez Canal back then. Like, why bother crossing this part? The reason why the Red Sea crossing, I think in my mind, makes so much sense down here is because you literally get stuck between a rock and a hard place. There's nowhere to go but through the water, right? That's why I really believe that this. And then if Mount Sinai is actually down here, well, then it changes a lot of the understanding of like, because it does kind of make it seems strange. Going back to this map, how exactly do they wander around this for 40 years? I mean, like, where do you wander? It's all mountains and like, whereas if you get into, oh, sorry, wrong way. If you get into this area, there's actually open places to wander up towards Jerusalem. I mean, there's not a lot of, if you cross here, like, are you wandering along here? You're really close to Egypt then. They can come get you whenever they want. It doesn't make sense that you'd be that close to Egypt if this is where you're wandering. The Amalekites already turned you back from being up here. It makes a whole lot more sense that they go over here and they're wandering in this area where people really don't know who they are yet. And that's also what's recorded too, is they're kind of in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, as they're kind of wandering around. People really don't know who they are. They're kind of confused. Who is this big group of people now just wandering amongst us? Well, the Egyptians would know who they are, right? So you'd think if they were here that it would make a lot of sense. The Egyptians would know. You see what I'm saying? Like after a fair number of process of elimination, it just seems more likely this is the spot, this is Mount Sinai, and then this is where the wanderings happened until they got to around about there. So, any questions on that? What's that? Okay. Let's look at chapter 14 of Exodus. Here's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. By the way, if you're into reading the Psalms at all, the crossing of the Red Sea is one of the primary miracle narratives that the Psalms will record. In other words, there's a thing called a lament psalm, and a lament psalm is that a psalmist will talk about how kind of miserable his life is, and he's pouring his heart out to God. And the lament psalm is a really cool thing because the method of moving a person from agony and sadness to joy and consolation in the Lord is the things he's already done, his past works, his magnificent acts, which, by the way, is kind of how we still do it today, right? When people are in misery and agony, what do we talk about? We talk about what Christ has done on the cross. This is not a new thing, right? So the psalmists do this all the time. When they want to talk about a gospel thing, God saving his people, they'll point back to the crossing of the Red Sea regularly. So in the Psalms, you'll get these kind of mentions of, you brought us through the water, or you struck down the Egyptians, or you washed away, they kind of allude to it all the time, the Red Sea crossing. It's really important if you want to read the Old Testament and understand it. This is like, Exodus is the gospel of the Old Testament, and this is the biggest gospel. Maybe Passover might be bigger, but this is pretty important. So let's take a look. And the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea, for Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden, that makes a ton more sense too when looking at the archaeological structures now, doesn't it? The geography, the land has shut them in, right? This is what he's getting at. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, and they did so. Okay? When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, and they said, what is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea by Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. Okay, so let's do this. Why don't you guys, at your tables, just for a minute, since we've read something interesting, and I forgot I wanted to do this more often, so I'm going to do it for you here. So we've got this thing here where God says, he says, let's see, verse 4, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and then verse 8, and the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued. So it seems very much like the Lord is making Pharaoh do this. So I might ask you, why don't you guys talk about it at your tables together, just for a moment, right? This whole issue of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, is this how he works with us? Is this something we need to watch out for? What does it mean to have your heart hardened? This question, any of these questions, or anything you want to talk about at your table, take a few minutes just to talk to one another, because I really want to encourage you guys to have some fellowship time during Bible study as well. So let's chat about this idea of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. What do we make of this? Go ahead. I'll give you a few minutes. Okay. So I'm curious. What do you think about this whole hardening of heart? Was it, well, actually, I won't give it away. What do you guys think? Anybody have any thoughts on the whole God hardening Pharaoh? It's kind of scary in a way, isn't it? That he would basically make Pharaoh an object of destruction. Pharaoh is something that's going to be destroyed or wiped off the map and God has willed it to be so. He's going to harden his heart till Pharaoh eventually runs himself into the bottom of the Red Sea. So, any thoughts about that? To reveal the truth to you, the first 5, I think, times in the Bible where Moses does a plague, and then Pharaoh asks for him to make it stop, and then Moses makes it stop, and then Pharaoh says, okay, well, I'll let you go, and then Pharaoh hardens his own heart and says, no, I won't let you go, right? Those are the first 4 or 5 times. So I think the first 4 or 5 times, those are meant to be signs that Pharaoh should learn and turn from this. Because remember where we leave off with the end of Genesis? What's the situation like at the end of Genesis? Is Pharaoh a bad character or a good character at the end of Genesis? I wouldn't say he's a bad character. I don't know if he's necessarily a good one, but Joseph is a second-hand man, and Pharaoh and Egypt basically saves the entire Middle Eastern world by saving all the food. So it's not as though, that God has completely turned his back on saving people that are not Israelites. He does that a lot. But he hears the cries of his people under the groans of their taskmasters, and then he goes to Pharaoh and tries to change his mind, and Pharaoh keeps hardening his own heart till eventually God just gives him over to that thing and hardens it for him, right? This is echoed, by the way, in the book of Romans. Paul talks about this, that people going after sin and various kinds of lechery, eventually God just gives them over to that thing and basically hardens their heart against him. Kind of a scary thought. Do you need to worry about God hardening your heart? I don't think so. Well, maybe. I would say if you're here regularly, I don't think so. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, if you're hearing the Word of God regularly, if you're in the Scriptures regularly, I don't think you have anything to fear about God hardening your heart. Am I crazy in saying that? Yeah. Right. I think the one thing that we might be at risk of is if there's a particular sin in our lives that we're completely unwilling to repent of. That would be a hardening of heart that could be dangerous. Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's funny, after that 5th time, he kind of says, well, I'm going to make my glory over Pharaoh at that point, too. Yeah. Right, I'm going to prove. Mm-hmm. Yep, agreed. So let's look at verse 11. So this whole thing happens, Pharaoh shows up, everybody's scared. Verse 11, and they said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. This is, what kind of person is this? You know what? I think we should maybe not be so hard on the Israelites. Because what are they at this point in time? If you want, whatever kind of language you want to attach to it, but they're slaves. They have a slave's mentality. It's like they have, I don't know if this works exactly right, but it's like maybe a type of PTSD. They cannot think of any kind of reality that exists that's different from what they know. Yeah? Thank you, Tim. Yes. They've been slaves for 400 years. They're absolutely, so the slavery is not whips, and it's not big muscular taskmasters. It's in here. and it's in here. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They've beaten down, and also their faith is completely gone. I mean, they still know their God, the God of the Hebrews and the God of Genesis, who did all kinds of miracles in Genesis too. And they don't think he's going to do anything for them because of the misery and the slavery they've gone through. Someone said some over here? Someone chirped up over here too? This comes into play later on because they cannot get out of this. They keep bringing it up. Even after the Red Sea crossing, they keep saying things like, would have been better for us to die in Egypt around the leeks and the meat pots than die out here of lack of water and lack of food, right? They say it all the way through the book of Numbers. They just cannot get out of their slavery mindset. And eventually God says what? I'm going to let you wander till this entire generation of slaves is dead. And the next generation is what? It's a generation that lives in freedom underneath God's care. These are the people he's going to take into the promised land. Right? As much as the Red Sea crossing will be meaningful to these people, you'll notice as you read the book of Exodus, the book of Numbers, and the book of Deuteronomy, they cannot get out of their own heads. They live as slaves in their own heads. Oh yeah, sure. The Egyptians, yeah. 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 Yeah, Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians that basically God led them around in the wilderness and they left a trail of dead bodies wherever they went. It's kind of gruesome, but it's true. It's how it kind of goes for a while. So let's get into the actual thing here. So we get into 15. We'll start at 15. The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." So I have a quick question. Why doesn't God just do this on his own? Why does he let Moses put out his staff in order to break the Red Sea in twain? I mean, God could just do it. Why does he ask Moses to put his staff out there? It's the same reason that God somehow allows me and Pastor Smith to use the words of institution, and there is Christ's body and his blood on his altar. Right? Like he gives us these gifts so that God's people may put their trust in God's leaders, right? Because a church with no leader is going to struggle. This Israelite company with no leader is going to struggle. Martin Luther talks about the ascension. It's a really cool sermon if you ever have a chance to read it, the ascension sermon. He talks about when Jesus says, it's better for you that I go away. And we would say, in what world is it better that this guy would leave us? And the answer is, if Jesus is alive and he's living in Israel, the only people who get to see Jesus are who? Probably rich, probably powerful people who live there. None of the rest of us are going to get to see him. But if Jesus goes up into heaven and sits down on his throne, well, now he can be present at every single altar in an LCMS church around the world, which means a lot more people are going to get to see Jesus than they would have before. I think the same thing counts here. I think God is trying to give them a leader that they can actually see and go to and talk to. And then eventually Moses does more than that. He says, well, not just me, now it's 72 elders. Now you have way more opportunity, whereas, the story of like moving the ark from one place to another, you touch the ark in the wrong way, what happens? You're dead, right? So you want to be in contact with God, you want to talk to God, but at the same time, being in contact with God and talking to him is kind of a dangerous endeavor. So now you've got eventually 72 people you can actually talk to who can take your things to God and be intermediaries between you and him. Go ahead. Yeah, yeah. Regular. Yeah, well, they do it all the time. Yeah, like, we don't want to talk to God. You go talk to God. Yeah, so there is that. Yeah. They tied a rope around his leg. If he died, because the problem is becoming a priest is a long process. Most people who were priests were older. So if they died, no one could go in and get the high priest because only the high priest is allowed in there. So he would go do his work with a rope. And if after a certain amount of time he didn't come out, they'd figure either he died of natural causes or he died because he wasn't supposed to be in there, i.e. he had sin. And they would pull him out by the rope, make sure he came out again. Interesting stuff. I think it's important that God sets up Moses as his representative. And so he lets Moses, use the staff and do this whole thing. But ultimately, who's the one cutting the Red Sea in two? It's God. It's not Moses. So, now here's where it gets interesting. Verse 19. Then the angel of the Lord who was going before the host of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them. So I want to just it's kind of cool to think about it maybe in perspective. I thought I had a picture of just I guess right here is probably fine. Yeah, maybe right here is okay. So they were here. Probably, if you're a leader, you're out front, and the pillar of fire is out front, right? So maybe God's out here somewhere. He goes behind them between the Egyptians and the people of Israel here, blocking their path. Verse 20, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove back the sea by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right and on their left. The Hebrew is really cool here. It talks about the water. Do you ever translate this Hebrew? It talks about the waters being stacked up like blocks. That's how the Hebrew actually talks about it. It's really cool. And the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea. Let's see here. Yeah, it never talks about the pillar of fire ever moving. All of a sudden, the Egyptians are just hot on their tail. But I would imagine that the pillar of fire would have to move eventually so they could actually get in there after them. But it never actually says that in the text. Verse 23, the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and in the cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, let us flee before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. Which, honestly, at that point, it's kind of like, duh. I mean, you're walking on the bottom of a sea, and there's walls of water, and when an angel looks at you, then you're like, oh, I guess the Lord's fighting for them. There's walls of water next to you, pal. What are you thinking? The Egyptian chariot wheels were really cool inventions. The chariots were very lightweight, and they would put rawhide around a wooden frame, a 4x4 frame with the circular thing. And then they'd spray water on the rawhide. The rawhide would shrink up around the tire, make it really, really tight. And a really strong tire, but also very light wheel. But the problem you can see here is this. You get into deep mud, what's going to happen? You're just, all these areas are going to be clogged up with mud. It's going to be impossible to get anywhere. And I should say, too, they were fast. You probably know this from just those of you who are into sport, into cars or whatever. But when you have a really wide wheel as opposed to a really narrow wheel, right? The narrow wheels are easier with a chariot to go faster, but they're not really great when you get into mud. So these wheels were really narrow, and they're really wide open, and they would easily fill with mud. Yeah. It's really cool how it talks about this, that the pillar of fire is basically right like this. Why do I never have a marker that works? I don't understand. What is going on with me? Is this one going to work? Nope, that one's not going to work either. No good. So somehow, in the midst of this, they're like the Hebrew. When you get to translate this Hebrew, it's really fun. It's like some weird stuff that's happening here. It basically, you get this idea that there's these eyes in the middle of this pillar of fire that are staring down the Egyptians. and it sends them into a panic. They can see some kind of outline of a figure inside the fire, and they don't know who it is. I think we all know who it is. Right? It's Jesus. Right? And he's looking at them. It throws them into a panic, and you can see how if you've got this kind of wheel and you're turning Hueys, right, you're going to get stuck. It's just going to happen, which does, and we can see why the water then catches them all unawares. I hadn't heard that. I like it, though. Okay, so verse 25. Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. Now he's on the other side of the sea, obviously. And the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained, but the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Okay? So the Lord saves them. And the really weird part, turn to page 15. Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord, saying, and then it's a great song, by the way. Chapter 15 is a fantastic song. But you read the Hebrew, and it's pretty clear that they're over on this side, and they're singing this wonderful song, and like dead bodies are washing up on the shore. It's a very macabre thing that's going on here. They're singing this really happy-go-lucky song. You know what it reminds me of? Have you watched Star Wars? Okay? You know where I'm going with this, right? The end of Return of the Jedi, they're all singing a happy song, and they're playing drums on dead stormtroopers' heads. It's creep. You got to go look at it again. You apparently were not paying attention. There are dead bodies all over the place. They're playing xylophone on dead stormtroopers' heads, and we're all like jumping around like, this is great, this is fun. That's the picture I get in my head when I think of this scene. It's very creepy. But also, it's a miracle. It's an amazing miracle. So I got a Star Wars reference in there today, so I'm feeling good. Okay. So, any questions or any final thoughts before we close off Bible study time today? Yeah, I wonder, do you think that he hardened the hearts of all the soldiers too? I think this is a typical, we can lay their souls at the feet of Pharaoh. I think he's the one ordering them to go do stuff. I don't know, because their reaction when they see the eyes is, let's get out of here, right? Right. I would probably disagree with you. And I don't necessarily know if you're right or I'm right, but I would take the other tack. I think Pharaoh orders them in. I mean, that seems to me more likely in terms of humanity. We've seen plenty of other instances where a really bad leader has ordered a lot of people to their death. Yeah? I've seen that more in history than the latter. But any other thoughts, questions? Let's pray the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right. Well, thanks for being here today. Appreciate you guys.
From verse 17. Thou hardened the hearts of the Egyptians.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So, it didn't say Pharaoh, it says the Egyptians. So that's where I got he had to harden their hearts to it too. Otherwise, some of them are going to be going, hey, this is kind of dumb. Let's not do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Where is it? Oh, they didn't show the kid playing on the dead heads.